The debate so far has done a really good job of summarising lots of the reasons why I chose earlier last year to bring forward a private members bill to address some of these issues around addictive features of smartphones and social media, to do with the impacts on sleep, mental health, educational attainment, and increasingly evidence about the concerns related to conspiracy theories and their ability to spread, particularly amongst young children. What I want to focus my remarks on today are specifically about the evidence, because I think it's in the evidence where the political debate is moving to. That's where there seems to be the greatest disagreement about whether we've got enough evidence now to act with confidence, or whether we should pause and wait for further evidence to be established. And so I want to spend a few moments focusing my remarks on that. And there's three ways that I think about this. The first is that globally, in 2012, something happened. Not just here, but around the Western world, and in fact beyond the Western world. Specifically to do with teenage mental health, and specifically to do with levels of anxiety and depression amongst our young people. Now, that global event coincided with the rise in access to smartphones and the access to social media and high-speed internet. There is no other plausible hypothesis I have heard, come across, and I welcome interventions from colleagues here today, to explain that global phenomenon. There is no coherent alternative hypothesis. And so when we think about the evidence that we require to act in this country, we should think really carefully about whether or not we are looking at actually developed different hypotheses for why this problem has grown. The second, this links to another member's point, is the precautionary principle. The tech industry in particular is very effective at casting doubt over findings from studies that have been produced. And so what has happened over the years is the burden of proof, the burden of evidence on those, like many of us here today and the petitioners who brought this forward, the burden of proof falls to them to establish beyond reasonable doubt that there is a link, a causal link between the use of smartphones and social media and the harms that it may cause. But I think that it's important in this debate and in others to balance where that evidence should be brought from. So surely we should have a burden of proof on those rolling out, technology platforms that are gobbling up huge amounts of children and young people's time. These are fairly conservative estimates, but the average 12-year-old is spending the equivalent of a part-time job every week on their smartphone. Now, surely that must have had some effect on how they might have used their time before that had happened, and the development of their brains and their relationships with other people whilst they're on those platforms. Surely, yeah.
Thank you to my honourable friend for giving way and for his private members bill, which I wholeheartedly support. On the evidence, would he also agree that there's now increasingly pilots? Obviously, one was referenced in the Swipe documentary, but the All Saints Catholic College of my school, where I had 70 parents 2 weeks ago meet to discuss this topic, have seen in their own evidence base in the school the impact of a much stricter smartphone policy. So we're starting to see both the evidence of the harms, as you've talked about, but also some interesting pilots that show what the improvements could be if we take on measures like the internet age of consent and a stronger policy on schools.
Yeah, and I thank my honourable friend for his work on this issue in his constituency as well. And he's absolutely right, both with micro-experiments, but also with the anecdotal feedback that that we've had from members of the public, many of whom have signed this petition in large numbers, show that parents are really worried that something is going on here, that the evidence will take some time to gather. So the second aspect there is about where the burden of proof should lie, and applying the burden of proof in one direction only to those advocating tighter regulation is not balanced. It should apply both ways. And the third point about evidence is to do with the absence of causal studies that we have at the moment that will take many years to acquire, and what we do in the absence of those causal studies with the weight of correlational evidence that sits before us. And this is where I think we must look at the work of Sir Austin Bradford Hill. Now, the Bradford Hill criteria, which were named after him in the 1960s, were based on the epidemiologists' work to try to fill in the evidence gap for policymakers when the debate was being had about the public health impacts of smoking. The tobacco industry did a very effective job of casting doubt over whether or not it was smoking itself that caused cancer, or whether, as the industry then said, smoking simply brought cancer out earlier, that it was something that was inherent within people. That was the argument. And they said there was no correlational study to prove that that was not the case, which goes back to my burden of proof argument. Now, in trying to fill in the gap, because we will not have causal studies for many, many years, and so petitions like this will continue to come, this debate will carry on raging, and politicians will be pulled towards this problem until we find a way of solving it. In the absence of those correlational studies, we have to find a way of applying a framework to look at the existing causal studies that sit before us. And the Bradford Hill criteria, when you look at the factors, it's 9 factors, I won't go through all of them, but for example, dose response rate. So does the amount of time or the amount of dose of a certain factor relate to the degree of the impact? UK Millennium Cohort Study 2019. Social media use is associated with mental health in young people. The greater use means greater impact. 2022 dose response meta-analysis. More time spent on social media was significantly associated with depression. There are stacks of these studies out there that show the correlation between time spent and impact. And when you work through those 9 criteria, in the absence of a causal study or series of causal studies, I think the evidence points in the very clear direction that we need tighter regulation that can empower parents to set the boundaries, the collective rules for how our children use smartphones and social media. And the final thing to say is that there is at times a risk that this debate gets characterised into pro or anti-tech. And my final reflection really is that for the UK to be the global sandbox of great tech development, which it should be, we need really good, intuitive, shared rules that can garner high degrees of public consent and support for us to be that incubator of great tech. And this is one of those issues where if we move quick, if we do it smart as a country, we'll get the benefits not only for economic growth and the tech industry, but also for our children and their future.
Yeah.